Every story has an author. Every author has a story. Join us for off-the-page interviews, inside stories, and a look into the world of publishing. This is Page Turners. Welcome to Page Turners, presented by the Agency of Brown Books. My name is Hillary Kennedy, and I am excited to introduce you today to Dr. Matthew Croston, who has a distinguished career in Russian studies. He's the Executive Vice Chairman of ModernDiplomacy.eu and the Senior Doctoral Faculty at American Military University, and his research specialty is international security and intelligence across the post-Soviet space. And he is also the author of the new book, Russia Reconsidered: Putin, Power, and Pragmatism. So let's welcome Dr. Matthew Croston. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
All right, so it sounds like you have a very extensive background when it comes to Russia. So tell me a little bit about that background.
Well, you were right. Educationally, it's been pretty much committed and connected to post-Soviet space from the very beginning. My 3 higher degrees, bachelor's, master's, PhD, have all connected to that area of the world. All of my research has always been sort of focused in and around that area. But for me, even on a personal level, it's been impactful pretty much for 30 years, and I'm only 46. I've been interested in this region of the world, so that means a lot to me as far as real life experience. I've worked there, studied there, conducted research projects there. The very first experience I ever had, I was sent as a junior abroad from Colgate University, and it just happened to be the timing of history because I went to the Soviet Union but came back from the Russian Federation. It was the year it all fell apart.
Oh, wow.
Was when I studied abroad there. And I've always explained it to people, is once you sort of get a chance to be a witness to living history like that, you just never get it out of your system.
Right, changes you.
It just stays.
Well, so what do you think most Americans get wrong about Russians?
The thing I say the most often is actually, because the list is long, but the one I think they're most surprised to hear is just how similar I think the two peoples are, and that maybe sometimes some of our conflict or some of the tension that happens between us on the diplomatic or political level is because of the fact that as people, we're actually very similar to each other in personality terms.
I wouldn't have thought that. That's interesting. Can you give an example of our shared cultural personality traits?
First, we're probably 2 of the brashest people on earth. and also we're 2 of the brashest and the most proud of it. Like with both Russians and Americans, you will know immediately if we like you or don't like you. We won't hide it. We won't hide it. We're proud to show it. We're very forthright. We're very upfront. We're very blunt. We have the same sense of humor. Russian jokes, when you translate them over, always play in America, and American jokes, when they get translated over into Russian, kill in Russia. So most people don't realize on that personal level. And then finally, on a more serious side, we are the only 2 countries, and there might be some pretenders to this throne, but we're the only 2 countries that have really a decided and long tradition of thinking that we're specially unique in the world stage. That in academic terms, in America, we call that American exceptionalism. In Russian terms, we call that the messianic curse of Russia, Russian messianism. But what we don't usually identify is the fact that these are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. That what they really mean, it doesn't matter what you mask them in. The ultimate base issue for both Russia and America is that we think we were put on this planet and developed as a country to do more than just our own little thing on our own little territory, that we have a special role to play. And those are the only 2, I've been all over this world and traveled to many different places. Those are the only 2 countries where I found the people most adamant about that belief.
That's really interesting. Well, one thing, you criticize how the U.S. government has formulated its foreign policy towards Russia, going back several presidential administrations. What's the essence of your criticism there?
For me, we've coined this term in the book that's basically called, I've called for a long, long time, Cold War Pathology. We can't, this is the Americans talking. The Russians suffer a little bit from it, but the Americans, ironically, we won the Cold War, and yet we suffer from this pathology when it comes to Russia more than the Russians do. That we are obsessed by this idea that the Russians think of themselves only as the Soviets, and that their ultimate goal is to get back to the Soviet Union. The problem with that is it means that it biases everything. We color everything through this lens of looking at Soviet strategy, Soviet history, Soviet culture, to define what they're doing today. Just a quick example, and this made huge headlines all over America, all over Western Europe. There was an interview, Putin loves the media. And he has this one show that's called in Russian Prямaya Linia, which is like open line, where people can call, literally just call an open line, and he sits in front of a camera and just talks to the people.
Wow.
And in one of these interviews, one of these programs, he said that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution, the breakup of the Soviet Union. And that was launched upon by every media outlet in the West, as you might imagine, saying, uh-oh, Putin regrets that there's no Soviet Union. Putin's going to want to bring the Soviet Union back. Watch out the Baltics. Look out Eastern Europe. He's coming for you. But what was sort of inappropriate, or maybe even slightly irresponsible, was in that same answer, he went on to explain that what he meant by tragedy was after the Soviet Union fell apart, it was basically the 90s, right? And in the 90s, the Russian Federation, the post-Soviet space, became more crime-ridden, more corrupt, more unhealthy. There's a period, not to be like a democratic health specialist, but there was a 5-year period in the 90s where the male life expectancy in Russia went down a year for every year for 5 consecutive years.
Really?
You don't have to be an expert. That's almost impossible to do. And yet the Russians did it. So even to a point when I began late 90s to begin my doctoral studies, and I was interested, of course, in pursuing things dealing with this area, I was actually sort of discouraged from it, because I had some people say, listen, who knows, 20 years from now, there might not even be a Russia. It'll just be this landmass of widows and old men. So that's the tragedy he was talking about. But all we did was take that first line, and suddenly it became he is this warmongering, aggressive person who's trying to retake all these countries.
Right.
So it's that type of dilemma that we point out in over and over and over again in the book to show how we're sort of painting the wrong picture, and it sets us at a disadvantage, not so much the Russians.
Right. So let's talk Russian hacking scandal, because that's something we're hearing a lot about. So you're pretty critical of how the Russian hacking scandal is portrayed across the American media. Kind of give us your take on how the media portrayed the hacking during the 2016 election and how it's really hurt our relationship with Russia.
Right. This is the time where you sort of take a time out and do like the aside. My caveat is I'm not endorsing Russian hacking of any American elections. It is wrong.
Right.
But I've also, out of these discussions with many, many different colleagues and relevant policymakers in D.C., it said that Putin for me has almost become like the Bill Belichick of global affairs. If you know Bill Belichick of the New England Patriots, yes. This dawned from not that long ago. I saw an interview with one of the major engineers that actually structurally built Facebook. And they brought him on to like the Today Show or something, doesn't matter. But to talk about what this Russian hacking and the fake news and the Russian bots was really all about. Mm-hmm. And he mentioned this, and he didn't even think it was important what he had said. But to me, it was like crucially the whole essence of the problem was he said, the thing is what the Russians did with these bots is they took advantage of a loophole in our own engineered structure of Facebook to be able to utilize it in a way we had never thought of before. So he said technically it wasn't illegal, but it was wrong. And that's what instantly makes me think of Bill Belichick. Is like in the NFL, everyone always is, all right, it wasn't illegal what you did, but it's not right what you did. It wasn't right what you did. And that's what Russia has continuously done in foreign affairs over the years when it finally became clear through the 21st century that it wasn't going to be able to craft this special relationship with the United States, that the United States didn't seem that interested in being a true partner and being a true collaborator, even in issues where we thought we might have common interests, like, say, counterterrorism. Mm-hmm. We kept sort of spurning their overtures. So the Russians, and I don't think this is unique to the Russians, I think Americans share this, but the Russians very much believe in this sense. When someone asked me about this book, they said, well, is it, keep your friends close but keep your enemies closer? And I said, that's not what it is at all. What actually fits the Russians better is a different kind of saying, which is, I'd rather be your friend, but the only thing worse than being an enemy is being a nobody. Mm. And that's deeply important to them. And for most of the 21st century, the Russians have felt that America has continuously tried strategically, diplomatically, militarily to make them feel on the world stage like they're a nobody.
Right.
So that's part of their gamesmanship. They don't really believe they affected the election with the hacking or the release of Democratic emails that tried to embarrass Hillary or something like that. Mm-hmm. They just wanted to be able to, one, prove they had the power and the technology and the capability to be respected. Mm-hmm. And two, if it made things a little more difficult, a little more chaotic in America, so be it, because you've actually done some things to us that have made us feel a little chaotic and a little unprotected and things like that.
Well, that leads me to something I'm curious to know. What do you think about the Trump administration?
That's a complex question. Only because I also don't buy into, we have this running theme here, is that what mainstream media gives us as sort of the parameters of a question or what's eligible as an answer tends to usually not be the reality of what's available to us if we just do a little bit more digging and a little bit more thing. To understand how Trump got elected, right now, Democrats have, for example, sort of focused on the idea that, well, Russians rigged it, or we were sort of lazy, or a combination of those two. And that doesn't help them very much as far as moving forward to 2020, I believe. But it also ignores some really important aspects of globalization, the loss of a lower middle class in America, the loss of a successful and prosperous industrial manufacturing base in America, the idea of not just how Republicans might sometimes utilize certain strategies to manipulate those things in their favor, which they're totally in their right to do, right. And also how the Democrats sometimes maybe sort of snobbishly dismiss some of these things as we don't have to worry about that. We're the party of the elite now, and we'll have people come out and vote for us no matter what. Right. All of those things combined together, and each one of those things you probably could write a book on, but you put all of that together, that was the recipe that existed in 2016, and part of it is how that answers how Trump came about. It's not just, well, the Russians put Trump in the White House.
Right. Well, then let's talk.
We push that hard in the book.
Right. No, that's a really interesting perspective, and I'm curious to know what you think about Vladimir Putin and why you feel like most American media and the academics, for that matter, misrepresent him.
We've even had this sometimes today, preparing for this interview. You always get these examples. Putin buys into this, so he's at fault for some of this. But he loves the fact that he has almost built an image, a public image internationally up, where he's almost like a James Bond supervillain. Right? And he uses that for all it's worth. All it's worth. But part of it is really, to me, I honestly believe is psychological. I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of Putin when he was a young man? Not as a young man, like, say, 12 or 13.
No, I haven't.
There's a famous picture that circulates around Russia that shows him when he was like a schoolboy. Total nerd. Total nerd.
That's hard to imagine.
And you can see instantly, and they talk about, well, you know, Putin used to be KGB. So obviously he's sinister and he's sly and he's devious. But he was actually, during his adult years when he was forming his career in the KGB and the security services, he was posted to Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe after the Berlin Wall fell. Right now, guess who got posted to Eastern Europe after the Berlin Wall fell? People who really weren't expected to rise high in the KGB. They weren't the players. They weren't the gamers. So he basically, and even the reason, and I don't want to get too like in the weeds of this, so I'm sorry about that, but it fascinates me, is that why Yeltsin chose him on December 31st, 1999 to become president, and he suddenly resigned when everyone was paying attention and worried to death about Y2K. And the universal reaction, even in Russia, we forget this now because it's been 18 years. On January 1st, 2000, everyone woke up and Yeltsin's resigned, Putin's in office. Everyone, even in Russia, the reaction was, who's Putin? No one knew who he was.
Wasn't a household name.
No one knew who he was. So part of the reason of bringing him in was the fact that Yeltsin and his team probably thought, this is a reliable guy, this is a guy who's not that spectacular, nothing to write home about, so he'll follow what we've been doing. He'll keep our plan in place, and my program, my legacy will go forward. They misjudged him on that because he had an axe to grind for sure. He had a lot of demons, I think, in his closet to get out and say, I have power now in a system that's set up to have the president have all the power. So I'm going to make things over the way I think is best for Russia. And that's how it took off. That Putin phenomenon came not so much because he was always a Bond villain. It's because he's twisted that with the help of Western media that likes seeing him that way, portraying him that way, and he totally buys into it and goes with it.
Well, so why do you feel like it's important for people to read a book about Russia?
We have this, I don't know if it's a joke per se, but there's always been this common understanding in academia, in diplomacy, even in the military, which is that don't ever forget about Russia because one way or another, they'll always find their way back. They never stay irrelevant for long, and we're going back like 1,000 years in history. But that's actually what we did forget. It's what we point out in this book over and over again, that we sort of thought with the 90s, as I mentioned before, all the bad things that were happening to Russia coincided with this problem called Islamic terrorism. So everyone was like, that's the new thing. These guys, maybe they won't be a country in a generation, or if they're still a country, they'll be a meaningless country. This new Islamic radical Islam thing, that's where all the action is. This is where you have to go. Right. That was a mistake on our part. Academically speaking, we should have remembered our own history, our own lessons, where we said they always find a way to come back. Yep. And they did. So that's why people need to understand, because look, when we've had this book planned in the works for quite a long time, and it took me several years to build it and create it. The issue of Russia and Russian-American relations has only become more intense.
Right.
Has only become more prominent and more important. And I don't think that trend is changing anytime soon.
All right, so Dr. Croston, in your opinion, can the United States of America and the Russian Federation ever be true allies? And then what do you think would need to happen in order for it to be that way?
I think the first best way for that to happen is to have President Trump name me his next ambassador to the Russian Federation. I'd be honored to serve and ready to serve in new and exciting ways that we haven't done before. But on a less grand note, more books like this, more authors, more voices, and it isn't even so much about generational. It isn't about waiting for the older generation to retire. It's just having people willing to accept new ideas and new opportunities to give perspectives. One of the things that's been the most disturbing to me in higher education in America today, we talk a lot about the shame that is safe spaces for students. But what we don't talk about is I really believe we've almost developed a safe spaces for professors. Mm-hmm. That professors don't engage one another anymore. We just have our little specialties. Leave me alone. I'll leave you alone. I don't want to tackle you. I don't want to challenge this. That really hinders and damages the debate and our level of knowledge on a lot of these issues. I've written this book largely to be issuing a challenge to all of those Russian specialists that don't agree with me, that don't like what I have to say. Let's get together. Let's be on the same stage before a huge audience, and let's tackle these ideas openly, respectfully, passionately. Everyone gets to benefit from that, even if you run the risk of being embarrassed. There shouldn't be safe spaces for professors, and that's what this book hopefully will start to do.
Well, I am excited about the book. I'm excited I got to talk to you today. Thank you so much, Dr. Croston, for being here.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. And we are so glad that you joined us here for Page Turners. We will see you next time for another exciting episode.